So with a global population expected to hit nearly 10 billion by 2050 and increasing per capita protein demand, all forecasts by agricultural economists indicate that meat consumption is going to roughly double or more by 2050. However, our current industrial meat production system is a threat to our long-term future, posing serious jeopardy to humanity and non-human animals across diverse areas, including climate change, biodiversity loss, food security, antibiotic resistance, pandemic risk, and more. Alternative proteins offer the chance to eliminate or mitigate these risks and other long-term risks. But reducing risks is only part of the potential value proposition for alternative proteins. Alternative proteins offer greater food and social system resilience for catastrophic events, and they could play a critical role in expanding humanity's moral circle and give us the chance to completely rethink our food and agriculture system to ensure long-term flourishing. So it's my pleasure to introduce Bruce. Bruce Friedrich is founder and president of the Good Food Institute, a global network of non-profit organizations with affiliates in the US, India, Israel, Brazil, Singapore, and Europe, in the UK and EU, that work on alternative protein policy, science, and corporate engagement. GFI is accelerating the production of plant-based and cultivated meat in order to bolster the global protein supply while protecting our environment, promoting global health, and preventing food insecurity. So please join me in welcoming Bruce.
Hello. You all are the early risers, the stalwarts, the ones who are dedicated. I am absolutely delighted to be here. Thanks very much to Sim for the introduction. Thanks to Izzy and all the EAG organizers for putting together just another incredibly stimulating and high-impact conference. I have been going to these conferences since I started working on GFI in 2015. And really, there's no second best to the EAG conferences in terms of the intellectual heft that comes into the presentations, this one exempted, and the conversations and the one-on-ones and the accessibility of people. So I am absolutely thrilled to be here and thrilled to be exploring this topic, long-termism and alternative proteins toward a fourth agricultural revolution. The observation is that we have been making meat in the same way for 12,000 years. Food is a technology. Making meat is a technology. The way we do it now is extraordinarily inefficient and comes with significant external costs that do indeed jeopardize our long-term future. This is Johan Rockstrom after the Eat Lancet Commission called on the world to eat 90% less meat back in 2018, 2019. He said humanity now poses a threat to the stability of the planet. This requires nothing less than a new global agricultural revolution. And that's what I'm going to be talking about, and I'm going to situate it in terms of effective altruism. So 5 parts to the talk. The first one is that meat production has risen inexorably for many decades, and there is no sign of that growth slowing. The second is that our only strategy for changing this trajectory is support for alternative proteins. There is not a tractable plan B, and I will dive into that a little bit. The third point is that alternative proteins address multiple risks to long-term flourishing, and they should be a priority for long-termists. I'm not going to try to convince you they should be the priority, or that that they're on par with AI risk or bioengineered pandemics, but I am going to try to convince you that unless you are working for an organization that is focused on one thing, you should add alternative proteins to your portfolio if you are focused on long-termism. Fourth, and I'll blow through this pretty quickly, but I do want to give you a sense of how GFI thinks about prioritization so that what we are doing as we expand is the highest marginal possible impact. And then we'll have some time for discussion, which Sim will lead us through, which I'm excited about. The first observation is that since 1961, global meat production has risen 300%. In China, it has skyrocketed by 1,500%. It's 15 times up since 1961. And meat production and consumption is going to continue to rise through 2050. So there have been 11 peer review articles looking at what meat production and consumption is going to look like in 2050. The lowest prediction is 61% more. One of the predictions is 3.4 times as much, so 340% more. Most of the predictions hover at about double. Most of that growth is not in developed economies. Developed economies have leveled off. They're going up a little bit. Most of that growth, as you can, actually you can't see here, but most of that growth, if you go to Our World in Data and pull up country by country, most of that growth is in developing economies and in Asia. The world doesn't have tractable solutions to this. Bill Gates, when he released how to avert a climate disaster, climate catastrophe, climate disaster, he, on his book tour, was talking about how the climate world had basically thrown up their hands on agriculture because the one strategy anybody was working on was try to convince people to eat less or no meat, and that wasn't working. That wasn't even working in developed economies. So we have been educating the world about the health consequences of meat consumption, the animal protection consequences of meat consumption, the environmental consequences of meat consumption. These are 3 articles about major peer review studies about the environmental consequences of meat production in 2016, 17, and 18. And through that time, meat production, even in the US, has continued to go up. And in fact, no society in the history of the world has been more educated about the external costs of meat production than the United States right now. If you care about this issue at all, it's impossible not to know about the adverse environmental consequences of meat production. And yet in the US, the 5 highest years for per capita meat consumption are the most recent 5. Simply educating people about the harms of industrial meat production does not seem to be working. If it's not even working in developed economies, despite the best effort of many, many advocates and activists across global health, across environment, across animal protection, it's unlikely to work in the developing economies, where basically what they're trying to do is catch up with us in terms of protein consumption. And none of this is to say that education isn't a good idea. We should be educating people. I started GFI as a result of education, the form of being educated about the external consequences of industrial animal production. The folks who started all of the formative companies in this space, most of the scientists who were working on it, changed their vocations because they learned about the harms of industrial meat production. But for the people on the ground, the consumers on the ground, the 10 billion people who are going to be here in 2050, where food choices are concerned, the vast majority of people simply don't incorporate external costs into their food production decisions. So what we need to do is, rather than convincing people to change their diets, we need to figure out how to create the meat that people love using plants or using cellular agriculture. So plant-based meat is not convince people to pay more for something they don't like as much. That's not the goal of plant-based meat. The goal of plant-based meat is to recognize that meat is made up of lipids, aminos, minerals, and water. Plants also have lipids, aminos, minerals, and water. We can apply food science to plants and figure out how to create the exact same meat experience using plants. And because it is so much more efficient, as it scales up, we will be able to get to products that taste the same or better and cost the same or less. That is GFI's entire theory of change. Is that the products need to taste the same or better and cost the same or less. And then you can quibble about whether that is necessary but not sufficient, or whether the market can kick in and take it from there and just shoot us up the S-curve. But even if you think that is not sufficient, I would contend that that is absolutely necessary if we're going to change the massive trajectory through 2050. We think this is the one solution to meat production that analogizes to renewable energy and electric vehicles. So back to Bill Gates, when he's talking about how the climate community had thrown up their hands on agriculture, basically they just weren't excited about the idea that every other solution in food, maybe you can do it at the city level, maybe you can do it at the state level, maybe you can do it at the national level, But if you tax meat at the national level, or get the American Heart Association to spend $100 million telling people to eat less meat, or whatever else, the impact of that is going to be contained to the area where the education happens, or the area where the policy happens. The awesome thing about renewable energy and electric vehicles and alternative proteins is that science in Singapore or Israel or Taiwan or Japan or Korea, science anywhere can scale everywhere. The other part of the analogy that's true is that with renewable energy, there's an understanding, just what we know to be true is that through 2050, the world is going to consume more energy. 100% of predictions, assuming the world continues to develop, the world will continue to consume more energy. The solution cannot be, part of the solution has to be more energy efficient buildings. Part of the solution has to be educating people about their consumer choices to decrease individual energy consumption. But the solution to the problem of fossil fuels cannot be convince people to consume less and energy efficiency exclusively. We need a shift from fossil fuels to renewables. That's a big part of the solution. Similarly with electric vehicles, yes, we need more walkable cities. Yes, we need excellent public transportation. Yes, we should encourage people to ride bikes and walk. But inexorably, more miles will be driven and more cars will be sold through 2050. Same thing with meat. Inexorably, yes, we should educate people about the health, environmental, and animal protection consequences of meat eating. But globally, we're simply going to consume something on the order globally of twice as much meat by 2050. And the solution is to make that meat from plants and cultivate that meat from cells. It can't just be what we've been trying for more than 50 years, tell people to eat less meat. So what are the impacts of a shift to alternative proteins, assuming the theory of change works out? Climate change and land water use, and I'm happy to share this deck with anybody who would like it, so I might blow through some of these slides pretty quickly to give us some time for conversation at the end. But basically between 93 and 99% less land, roughly 90% less direct emissions, 87 to 99% less water, because you're not growing crops to feed them to animals so that we can eat animals, which is a shockingly inefficient system. There is now a scientific consensus that Paris climate goals are impossible unless meat consumption goes down. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says this explicitly in their last report, and they have no solutions for how you actually make that happen. The climate community broadly is pretty asleep at the wheel on this issue. So they encourage diet change, but their heart's not in it because it hasn't worked for 50 years, and and it seems unlikely to start working now. Food security is another really big issue. And this just makes intuitive sense. It takes, according to the World Resources Institute, 9 calories into a chicken to get 1 calorie back out. For pigs, it's 11 calories. For cows, it's 40 calories. And that means 9 times the land, 9 times the water, 9 times the herbicides and pesticides. It is just a shockingly inefficient system. So I co-wrote this article for Foreign Policy magazine in the fall about food security. And one of the anecdotes that my co-author and I tell in this story is about how the UN Global Envoy on Food in 2008 called biofuel production a crime against humanity. And the reason he called biofuel production a crime against humanity is that 750 million metric tons of corn and soy was being funneled into biofuels. It was driving up the price of cereals, and it was causing people to starve. 100 million metric tons. That same year, 750 million metric tons of corn and soy were fed to chickens and pigs and other farm animals. Exact same global relationship where food is concerned. By 2020, it was north of 1 billion metric tons of corn and wheat, and another 270 million metric tons of soy, which were being fed to farm animals that could have otherwise been going to, which was driving up the prices and leading to global starvation. So climate change, biodiversity, food security, antimicrobial resistance. The UK government says the threat to the human race from antimicrobial resistance is more certain than the threat from climate change. About 70% of all of the medically relevant antibiotics produced by pharmaceuticals are fed to farm animals. not because they're sick, but to keep them alive in conditions that might otherwise be lethal. And this is ushering an end to modern medicine. So this is the former president of the World Health Organization, Margaret Chan, saying the end of working antibiotics is essentially the end of modern medicine. AMR is already killing 1.3 million people a year. It's supposed to be killing 10 million people a year by 2050. And then finally, pandemic risk. The International Livestock Research Institute and the UN Environment Program pulled together 13 of the leading zoonotic disease specialists in the world. They listed the 7 most likely causes of the next pandemic. The first one is just more animals for food, increased demand for animal protein. These are direct quotes from their report. This isn't my distillation or paraphrase. So increased demand for animal protein is the #1 most likely cause of the next pandemic. And then if you read they say unsustainable agricultural intensification, but if you read the narrative, it has to do with genetic clone animals whose immune systems are depressed, and then the way that the animals are treated, which makes in sort of disease factories. And in fact, animal agriculture is linked to 6 of 7 of these. Somewhat ironically, the one that it's not linked to is increased use and exploitation of wildlife. But the other 6 are linked to this massive increase in animal agriculture. So for long-termists, they're listening to all of this and they're saying, yeah, that's all bad, but that's all short-termism. That's not long-termism. And I would just remind folks that in Toby Ord's book, The Precipice, he says risks greater than 1 in 1,000 should be central global priorities. So as I sort of nodded at the beginning, my goal is not going to be to convince you if you're working on unaligned AI or bioengineered pandemics, what are they, 1 in 10 and 1 in 30 existential risks, that this is something that you should do instead. But if you are working in policy, I think there's a general consensus that where you get 100,000x impact is convincing governments to take these things seriously and launch programs focused on them. You can have a more diverse portfolio than unaligned AI and bioengineered pandemics. And in fact, it's probably to our benefit to have a more diverse portfolio. And I would contend that alternative proteins should be a part of that portfolio for all of the reasons that I've just described. But I'm going to run through them just a little bit more. Climate change and existential risk. Ord puts the risk at 1 in 1,000. I'm reading the media, and the media is definitely biased in favor of trying to convince the world to take climate change more seriously. But I will say the degree to which warming is happening faster than anybody predicted 10 years ago, and the degree to which the consequences are different and more severe, I think bringing some humility around our capacity to predict. It definitely feels like things could spin more out of control, but even at 1 in 1,000, Ord said it should be a central global priority, which is where he places it. And then I'll just remind everyone that the short-term impact of climate change is massive refugee crises and other significant problems, especially in the global south. Climate change poses a widening threat to national security, food security and existential risks. So talking about food security and the fact that we're currently 1.27 billion metric tons of food being fed to farm animals. If that doubles through 2050, absolutely drives up harms in global development, malnutrition, starvation. And as Jean Ziegler said, it is a crime against humanity to cycle so many crops into chickens and pigs when they could be going to feed human beings. So Matt Spence, former official in the Department of Defense in the United States, as well as the National Security Council, talks about how food security is what really keeps people up at NSC and DoD at night, even more than many other risks. Obviously not going to surprise anybody in this room that conflict over food, conflict over resources, is one of the more common sources of conflict, which could spiral out of control. Water wars, basically the same argument. Massive water needs for industrial animal agriculture. That is slated to double through 2050. It's already a crisis and could spiral out of control, in addition to just the short-term global health and well-being issues with people not having water, not having food, and climate disruptions does have a significant possibility of leading to great powers conflict. Threat of conflict over war is growing. And then Ord says other environmental harms. And it's probably intuitive for everybody in this room But if you're doing something that in the best case requires 9 times the resources of producing the same product in a different way, in other words, chicken is the most efficient animal at turning crops into meat. It takes 9 calories in to get 1 calorie back out. And as I mentioned, that's 9 times the water, 9 times the land, 9 times the pesticides and herbicides. The UN released a report about 15 years ago now called Livestock's Long Shadow. And they said animal agriculture contributes to problems of land degradation, climate change and air pollution, water shortage and water pollution, and loss of biodiversity. And they conclude that the meat industry is one of the most significant contributors to the most serious environmental problems at every scale from local to global. That's now double that by 2050. And 1 in 1,000. I don't know if Toby is including the idea that this is going to double through 2050 in his calculations, but it's getting significantly worse, and our only hope of turning it back is to replace the products. We're simply not going to convince the world to eat less meat. And this is the one that I want to spend just an extra minute or two on, is pandemic risk. So Toby kind of goes back and forth between 1 in 10,000 and 1 in 2,000. And his quote is, if we take the fossil record as evidence that the risk was less than 1 in 2,000 per century, then to reach 1% per century would be at least 20 times larger. And he says this seems unlikely. And I'll just note that in 1800, so thinking about the fossil record, the world was consuming 10 million metric tons of meat. In 2000, 350. By 2050, something like 750 million metric tons of meat will be consumed on an annual basis. So I'm not sure it makes sense, and if it's true that of the 7 most likely causes, increased meat consumption is 2 of them and is linked to 6 of them, I think we may be extrapolating in a way that doesn't actually align with the actual risk. From a short-termist standpoint, I'll remind people that COVID-19, for people who are beginning to think about economic development as a cause area, and for people who are thinking about global poverty, of course, both of these are more short-termist rather than long-termist. As a cause area, COVID-19 was not particularly transmissible. It wasn't particularly deadly. And still, it cost the global economy trillions of dollars, killed millions of people, and sent more than 100 million people into dire poverty, all in the global south. And then moral circle expansion. Will talks about this in his book, obviously, but he says if we can improve the values that guide the behavior of generations to come, we can be pretty confident that they will take better actions, even if they're living in a world where very different from our own, the nature of which we cannot predict. And this is pretty standard in animal protection circles, maybe a little less standard outside of animal protection circles. The idea that if the vast majority of people in society are eating meat on a regular basis, they're simply not going to reconcile their internal ethics with the idea that animals matter. How you feed yourself is you pay people to factory farm animals, it becomes a lot harder to think about the argument for moral circle expansion, including animals in that moral circle. So if we can get to a world where animals don't have to be slaughtered for meat, and the animals who are slaughtered for meat are on smallholder farms or pastoralists or regenerative agriculture, which continues in the vision that we're thinking about, which I'm happy to chat more about. But that does widen the moral circle in ways that could teach AI going forward what values look like. So values lock in. So this is the central theme of the talk, is that, and I encourage people to pressure test think about it, and feel free to push back if you disagree, but alternative proteins, we think, are the only thing that can scale globally, and probably the only thing that's substantially likely to work even in developed economies. GFI, we're basically 2 alternative proteins, what Environmental Defense or the World Wildlife Fund are to things like renewable energy and electric vehicles. We are single-mindedly focused. Our entire endeavor is to create a world where plant-based meat and cultivated meat taste the same or better and cost the same or less, so that they can displace industrial animal agriculture. All right, this wants me to not. There we go. GFI uses the OKR system that Google popularized, so everything we do fits into 5 objectives. Under each objective, we have somewhere in the order of 5 to 8 key results. Our programmatic areas basically break down into science, policy, and corporate engagement. We are, at root, a scientific think tank. Until GFI came along, nobody had mapped the technological readiness of plant-based meat or cultivated meat. When we started, we weren't sure whether we were going to do cultivated meat. So the first two of the first 6 people who I hired in June of 2016 were scientists. And their first charge was to figure out whether cultivated meat was viable or cultivated meat was science fiction. And they dived in, and the more they dived in, the more viable we decided we thought it was, and the more viable the entire community decided it thinks it is. But we do a lot of original research. Our number one thing is building global scientific communities and basically open sourcing how we get from here to price and taste parity. So publishing peer review and other articles focused on letting the entire world know what it looks like to make cost competitive and taste competitive plant-based and cultivated meat. We have monthly science of alt protein webinars and lots of technical workshops, et cetera. These are some of the papers that we have published that are focused on what does it look like to get plant-based meat and cultivated meat to price and taste parity. We also have what we call our alt protein project, which is a super rigorous college program. It is a rigorous application process. It is a rigorous training process. And all of the alt protein projects also have to have objectives and key results. And they have to report in 3 times a year how their work is tracking against their key results. These are some of the resources for scientists, which you can find if you go to gfi.org/science. And policy, our global battle cry, so we agree with what I think is a fairly common assumption in EA, that if you have a cause area that you can get governments excited about, you can have 100,000x multiplier impact. So the way I think about it is we try to take our budget, which will be about $32 million this year across the 6 GFIs, and turn it into $10.1 billion in government funding. So we're really thinking about what does it look like to convince governments that they're currently funding climate mitigation efforts, they're funding biodiversity efforts, they're funding global health efforts. This is an incredibly tractable and important thing for governments to be setting up research centers focused on and for governments to be incentivizing private sector activity. So that's our global battle cry, that government should be funding this. And $10.1 billion is our current goal, $4.4 billion for R&D and $5.7 billion for private sector incentives. And these are just from the last couple of months. The US government, we convinced them to include alternative proteins in their bold goals for US biotechnology and biomanufacturing. About 8 months ago, it was in their national strategy for advanced manufacturing. This is Sana Beg, who is Deputy Undersecretary at USDA for the part of USDA that's most important to us. Her department oversees the Office of the Chief Scientist, the National Institute of Food and Agriculture, the Agriculture and Food Research Institute, Agricultural Research Service, and Economic Research Service. And just in the last 3 or 4 weeks, she has been at a ministerial dinner that we organized, an event at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, a panel that I was on at Agricultural Innovation Mission for Climate alongside the governments of the Netherlands, the UK, the WTO, and then Sana Beg for USDA, all talking about alternative proteins and the importance of government prioritizing that. So number one goal, advocate for public investment, and we also do NGO advocacy, work on cultivated meat regulation. GFI is not taking on industry, so GFI is not trying to take away subsidies, we're not trying to tax meat. This is our entire policy goal. 1, we want funds for open access science. 2, we want to incentivize private sector science. And 3, we want to incentivize private sector R&D and manufacturing. The climate bill that is the biggest climate bill in the history of the world, oddly enough called the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, all of it is positive. None of it is penalize fossil fuels, penalize gas-powered cars. All of it is affirmative. We're taking our page from that. And not focused on taking things away. I will skip the Global Innovations Needs Assessment other than this to say it's the UK Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office and ClimateWorks Foundation. They said by 2050, governments, there could be $1.1 trillion in gross value add to the economy from alternative proteins and 10 million jobs. And then the third pillar of the GFI, 3 legs of the stool, so the third leg of the stool, is industry engagement. And we do everything from pre-entrepreneur all the way up to relationships with the really big meat and food companies. The thing that I think we're doing that is most important is we have excellent relationships with Nestle and ADM, the 2 largest food companies in the world, as well as JBS, Tyson, Cargill, Smithfield, and BRF, which are the 5 largest meat companies in the world. And our message to the meat companies and the food companies is that this is the future of meat production, and you can be part of it or you can not be part of it. So analogizing to the advent of digital photography, Canon took advantage, Kodak did not take advantage. Kodak went bankrupt, Canon thrived. Do you want to be Kodak or do you want to be Canon? Is essentially the pitch. Unfortunately, all of the major food and meat companies are falling into they want to be Canon, which obviously makes our work so much easier on the policy front if major corporations are supporting rather than opposing it. We also do monthly business of alt protein webinars and lots of other industry and other webinars. Here are some of the resources for industry, which you can find at gfi.org/industry. Right now we have about 190 people across 6 areas of the world. We picked the areas of the world with a sum total of 0 interest in how much meat the country consumes, and 0 interest in the size of the population. So if you go to our 2021 year in review, you can pick to this. There's a slide that looks like this and it explains each country, and they're basically just 2 variables. Does the country fund significant amounts of science focused on global health and or climate? And do they have world-class scientific institutions? Because again, science in Israel or Singapore, we don't care what people eat in science in Israel and Singapore, but science there can impact this entire industry in ways that are very exciting. We were delighted that Giving Green, which is an EA climate charity evaluator, picked GFI as one of their top 5 choices for high-impact climate philanthropy. Here's how they explain they did tens of thousands of hours of work so that you don't have to. Very gratified for that selection. Animal Charity Evaluators, one of the 4 most impactful charities for animals, obviously taking animals out of food production altogether. And just to close, again, Dr. Rockstrom, humanity does indeed pose a threat to the stability of the planet. We need a new agricultural revolution. We've been making meat in the same exact way for 12,000 years, funneling crops through animals. It is way past time for an update. And we think that this is the way that we can scale solutions globally. And we think it's the only way we can scale solutions globally. Thank you very much, and I'm excited to hear what people have to say.
Great. Thanks so much for that, Bruce. So to kick us off, to help us understand the landscape a bit more, could you talk a bit about how much funding there is in this space from sort of governments, philanthropies, other actors?
There is vanishingly little funding in this space from governments, philanthropies, and other actors. So cultivated meat in all of time has brought in a little less than $3 billion. That $3 billion is spread across more than 100 companies. There have been a few that have raised hundreds of millions of dollars. But just to level set that, the world put $1.4 trillion into renewable energy last year. And 1 gigafactory for lithium-ion batteries costs on the order of $4.5 billion. And that's if it doesn't hit cost overruns, which is about a 0% chance. So more for 1 battery factory for EVs than has ever gone in to cultivated meat. On the plant-based meat side, it's on the order of about $10 billion, so that's basically 2 gigafactories. But it's still really nothing compared to the $1.4 trillion that is going into renewable energy. And one of the things that Giving Green says that I thought was pretty interesting is that renewable energy requires 10 times the land per unit of energy. Electric vehicles require cobalt from the Congo. They require lithium from Uyghur areas of China. They require nickel from Ukraine. With alternative proteins, we require a 20th of the land, not 10 times as much land. So it does feel like a particularly tractable ag solution, and really just a particularly tractable solution in the sort of overall scope of climate interventions.
And then speaking about kind of tractability and milestones, when do you expect plant-based and animal-based meat price parity? And then same question for cultivated meat.
It's really just in the last 8 to 10 months, we've gotten such phenomenal traction putting this onto the global agenda. It's really going to be a function of how quickly we can solve the price and taste questions. I think once we solve price and taste, there's the possibility of just shooting up the S-curve in terms of displacement. But sorry, your question was how do we was solving the price and taste parity issue. It's going to be a function of funding for science, and it's going to be a function of funding for infrastructure. The companies in this space are not going to get venture capital to build production plants, so they need to get in on climate-focused government-guaranteed loans to build plants. And we really need to scale up the amount of government funding for R&D, and it can happen quite a bit more quickly. I mean, we're at taste parity with Impossible burgers. We're at taste parity across cultivated meat, and getting to price parity is at least a few years off with plant-based burgers, and it's at least 5 years off at the most optimistic for cultivated meat. Maybe we could meet that if sort of the government interest really shoots up.
So yeah, 2 points. I was chowing down on an Impossible burger yesterday. It's just so good. Secondly, why wouldn't they get VC funding? Why do you think it has to be government? VCs are not going to want to put $500 million into a production plant, essentially. So that's not how. I mean, VCs haven't done that in any other context. And for companies that are fairly new, getting loans unless they have government guarantees is also super hard. So we're moving into what is oftentimes called the valley of death with a lot of these companies, where they've they've gotten to proof of concept, but what does it look like to scale up? And the funding for scale up is just not the traditional place of VCs. It's a lot of money to build a plant. And so it really is where governments have stepped in on renewable energy. It's where governments, I mean, Elon Musk talks about Tesla would have failed 2 different times if not for DOE loans. And that needs to happen here as well. Are there any promising cases of that happening anywhere in the world yet?
With alternative proteins, no, not yet. But seeing it in the bold goals for the bioeconomy from the U.S. government, seeing the U.K. government and all of the governments where GFI operates, India, Israel, Brazil, Asia Pacific, Europe, the UK, the European Union, UK, governments are recognizing this as a part of their national strategy, their bioeconomy plan. And there was just the Global Methane Hub and ClimateWorks Foundation, just maybe 2 weeks ago, released what they're calling their Global Innovation Needs Assessment for Methane Mitigation. And it looks at all of the methane mitigation interventions that exist in agriculture. So it looks at food loss and waste, it looks at rice mitigation breeds and where to grow so that rice methane would go down, looks at all of the various livestock interventions, and it looks at alternative proteins. And it is an unalloyed endorsement of alternative proteins as the most promising. But the fact that's on point is it says alternative proteins by 2050 could create 83 million jobs and $700 billion in economic activity. Across all of those interventions, alternative proteins is 98% of the economic value add and 70% of the jobs, which is obviously what governments are looking for when they're thinking about whether to integrate alternative proteins into guaranteed loan programs, is will they be paid back? More and more governments are being convinced that alternative proteins is a good play for being paid back and making their countries at sort of the forefront of plans for the future bioeconomy.
And then sort of looking at plant-based meat sales, they're sort of flagging in recent years. So what gives you confidence that they can, in fact, replace industrial animal meat?
Yeah, I mean, it's so fascinating to me. There have been a couple of high-profile stories that basically say plant-based meat sales are flagging, ergo plant-based meat is dead, the experiment didn't work. And our theory of change is that people will not pay more or sacrifice on taste. And we look at something like solar and EVs. Even 8 years ago, they weren't 1% of the market yet. So right now, if you analogize to solar and EVs, like people are not going to pay more for gross inconvenience about how energy production happens. The cost curve had to plummet for solar to really take off. With EVs, we needed a charging infrastructure, we needed more battery range, we needed costs to come down, and where EVs a decade ago were well under 1%, now people are looking at 2035 for EV domination, and that seems like a reasonable prediction. With plant-based meat, the fact that the Impossible Burger, the Beyond Burger, cost twice as much as ground beef, and neither of them satisfies all meat eaters, and those are the two best products that we have. So the idea that people are not broadly willing to pay more for something they don't like as much is a validation of our theory of change rather than a challenge to our theory of change. And there have been probably 15 studies of why people have not tried plant-based meat or why they tried it and stopped eating it. And literally 100% of those studies come up with, the first two are we didn't like them, they didn't taste good enough, or they cost too much, which validates our theory of change. If you can get to price and taste parity, you can make a huge, huge dent. I do think some people are just going to want to eat meat, and that's where cultivated meat comes in. But I think we can have many times the penetration that we have right now if we can get to price and taste parity. And what's happening with plant-based meat is a validation of that, not a challenge to it.
Mm-hmm. And then what are the biggest risks against these things happening? And what can academics and startups do to potentially mitigate these risks to progress?
I mean, the biggest opportunity, I suppose, is how do we get governments to put $10.1 billion into alternative proteins? The biggest risk is that they won't. Yeah, I mean, I think the number one thing we need to do is to continue to make the case. So if somebody is in global health, really doing some thought leadership around global health and alternative proteins, the AMR and pandemic risk arguments that I put up on the screen, and we'd be happy to work with you on that. If somebody's a thought leader in or could become a thought leader in food security, that would be another area where that's in dire need. Also climate and biodiversity. Like there's just vanishingly little that dives into the points that I made. But I will say the Center for one of the most exciting things to happen in a while, we contracted some research with the Center for Strategic and International Studies, which is listed as the top think tank in the world on quite a few lists, and the top 5 on just about all lists. And they ended up, just basically, they just say GFI's theory of change is right, essentially. So they look at AMR, they look at pandemic risk, they look at food security, they look at biosecurity risk, they look at food systems resilience, and across it they say alternative proteins is a key part of the solution, and governments should fund alternative protein R&D, and government should fund infrastructure and manufacturing build out. But diving into each of those areas and writing peer-reviewed journal articles and creating the sort of deeper case would be extraordinarily valuable.
Mm-hmm. And what are the strongest arguments against prioritizing alternative proteins that you encounter when you're trying to do your work?
I mean, with GFI and alternative proteins, we're in sort of a weird place where instead of starting at 0, we're starting at like -20. So you have to first get people to not think of alternative proteins as convince people to pay more for products they don't like very much. So it does get consistently conflated with telling people what to eat, changing human nature rather than changing the food, which is a pretty steep climb. And people in climate especially have some pretty serious PTSD around angry vegans, and also just not being enthusiastic about that theory of change and thinking this is that theory of change. Mm-hmm. But the report from ClimateWorks Foundation and the Global Methane Hub, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and lots of government movement, I think we're moving in the right direction.
Mm-hmm. And then we've got a question on fermentation-based proteins. Is there anything you want to say there?
Yeah, fermentation. There are two pillars of fermentation-based proteins. The first one is biomass fermentation. The second is precision fermentation. In the first case, that's things like corn, Q-U-R-O-R-N. There's a very exciting company in Chicago called Nature's Find that is doing that. Seems like it's even more efficient than plants. I traditionally, just so that people are not spending the first 10 minutes of the talk going, wait, what's fermentation? Group that into plant-based meat, and then I group precision fermentation into cultivated meat because it is a form of cellular technology. Precision fermentation is basically producing dairy proteins, egg proteins, and ingredients like the heme in the Impossible Burger using synthetic biology, and those are both extraordinarily promising.
Okay, great. And sort of like blue sky thinking, in 5 or 10 years, what do you think is like achievable at the top end if we work as successful?
I mean, I think it's not. I mean, it would be super optimistic, but I mean, I think if all of the governments that are leaning in on alternative proteins now prioritize them to the degree that they are a solution to problems that governments recognize that they have, I think we could get to in the next 5 years, $10.1 billion in government funding. I think on an annual basis, I mean, that's the prediction that Climate Works Foundation and the UK Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office have for what we need to actually get to price and taste parity as quickly as possible. But I think we could get there. That would be a super optimistic take, and that would entail research centers all over the world focused on alternative proteins and giving them their due as a climate, biodiversity, and global health critical intervention. So that I think would be the most optimistic. I'm consistently a little bit more over-optimistic than I should be about how quickly we can break down, we can sort of leap the barriers that we're coming up against. So making plant-based meat that is taste competitive has been harder than I thought it would be. Bringing down the cost curve and getting to market has been harder than I thought it would be on cultivated meat. I continue to be super optimistic about the prospects of both, but they could take a little bit of time. But the fact is, we're going to see, I mean, unless anybody has other ideas, we're going to see more and more and more meat through 2050. So there's a degree to which they take the time they need, since there isn't a plan B to making meat in these new and better ways.
Great. And I'll just have one last question so sort of funding is obviously a huge component, but talent's also a massive component. What do you want to see people develop skills in, and what would you recommend if people want careers in this field?
That's going to be such a person by person, I think, response. I mean, this is saving the world through science. So there are really big challenges on both the plant-based and the cultivated meat side. Mechanical engineers are absolutely required on both the plant-based meat and the cultivated meat side. But we also need tissue engineers. We need biotechnology sciences. Across the biological sciences, we need scientists. Policy continues to be, I think, the most powerful intervention. So having people like Sona Beg, very high up at USDA, is critically important to putting this onto the White House agenda. And that's policy is where you get 100,000x or a millionx impact, which is why it's GFI's #1 goal: turn our $32 million into 10.1 billion. So I think it's not that different from any other sort of 80,000 hours advice. You can go and do the direct work. You can also figure out how to be a catalyst for broader work. I mentioned we need thought leaders in global health. We need thought leaders in biodiversity. There are a sum total of 0 at the moment. And that would be pretty neat to see that change.
Great. Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking Bruce.